Thank you for joining us. My name is Jorge Brito. I'm the Trailblazer Society Manager at Rails to Trails Conservancy. I want to thank Eric Martin for speaking with us today from Wilderness Voyageurs. And I guess I'll start with that. Eric, your business has been going for almost 60 years. Can you explain a little bit about what Wilderness Voyageurs does? And can you talk a little bit about where the home base is, Ohiopyle, Pennsylvania, on the Gap?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Eric Martin, president of Wilderness Voyageurs. We are based in Ohiopyle, right along the world famous Great Allegheny Passage. We are 60 years old as a business, and I'm super fortunate to be a second generation outfitter. It was started by my folks in 1964, and we're the oldest whitewater rafting outfitter east of the Mississippi. So I grew up in the outfitting world, grew up next to the river. And that was our genesis was rafting and climbing and canoeing. And then the Great Allegheny Passage came into being and came right through the town of Ohiopyle where we're headquartered. My dad was actually really involved in getting some of the initial funding for the Great Allegheny Passage through the American Industrial Heritage Project. And so, we've been involved with the Gap from the very get-go, and to today, where bicycle touring is the largest division of our business. And for 45 years or so, everyone knew us as this whitewater rafting outfitter. And now, I run into guests in places all over the country, and they're like, "Oh, you're that biking company." So times have changed.
Well, I guess speaking of that, I also want to mention before I forget, if anyone has a question, you can drop it in the chat and we can address them as we go. I have a few that people sent ahead, but you mentioned times of change. What would you say has kind of made the bike side grow?
The bike side growth for us, it started naturally with providing services on the Great Allegheny Passage. Initially when there were lots of gaps, it was transportations, and then we have a bike shop, and so then we're doing repairs, and all those things led to providing guided, fully supported tours. I think as the population has aged in the U.S., there's been a shift in activity. And so, we do see, we're fortunate. We've been doing outfitting business stuff for a long time. And, we see people on our bike tours today that rafted with us 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And so, I think that general shift has, we've ridden the wave of what's happened with the population and the activity. And having Rails to Trails, building out all these amazing resources has built more venues for our guests to want to go explore, and the whole population wants to go explore.
So, as someone who grew up in Ohiopyle, how would you describe the change in the town with the trail? I believe you saw the last train literally leave town.
I
Can you
did.
can you describe how Ohiopyle became a trail town and that caters to business on the trail?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to see that last train on the Western Maryland happen. I was a kid. Um, what has been dramatic is that as a rafting town, Ohiopyle's been a tourism town for forever, effectively. Um, but rafters were okay, come go rafting, and then back to the campground, so on and so forth, pretty self-sufficient. As people were coming into town for biking, it's really changed the amount of support activities, the type of support activities. The visitations changed so much. Not just like through bikers, but that group coming into town maybe just for a couple hours. And so a lot more of their day is spent in the town. They're back and forth on the trail, whereas someone on a river trip touches town, is out in the woods all day long, comes back, wants to go get in dry clothes, moves on. So, the biking tourism just increases the need for, whether it's ice cream or service to the bikes or rental of bikes. There are all these other touch points that, really influence how much of town or um, how much of the economy is impacted.
So speaking of economic impact, I was kind of curious because Wilderness Voyagers offers trips, not just rail trail bike trips, but um, trail trips and road trips throughout the country. Could you talk a little bit about that economic impact? Do you have any like numbers you could or examples you could give of how you fill up a hotel or take over a restaurant for the night?
You bet. We operate tours on 55 rail trails at this moment, plus a lot of other places. And I know some folks were just recently with us out on the Katy, and you're a big fan of Roachport, and that is
Yeah.
a good example of a town where, we run fairly small trips, so our groups are of 12 people. Um, and so that allows us to get into some pretty small towns and then probably have an outsized impact. Um, we're going to take we're going to take a full bed and breakfast or multiple bed and breakfasts, and we're going to fill them up. We need meals, those types of things. And we tend to, or not tend to, we intentionally build trips to be sort of off peak days. So, a rail trail, is going to have that busy visitation on a Saturday or Sunday, which may be great, but it doesn't necessarily allow a business to, to build out to be sustainable. 2 nights a week's not enough to survive on as a hotel or a restaurant, so on. So, what we tend to be very stable in how we operate. So, on the Katy, we're, running trips 12 times a year. We've been doing that for 10, 12 years. And so, our lodging partners have that opportunity to really have some revenue stability and,
Mhm.
seeing it in advance. We like to work and build opportunities. Roachport's a great one, where, the general store provides us dinner. So we do a really amazing, like, home style dinner, but that's not one of their normal offerings.
Hmm.
And so, here we are on a Tuesday or Wednesday night, and we helped develop that initially, like, hey, what if? And next thing you know, here's this small general stores getting the benefit of a $600, $800 dinner that they're providing on a Tuesday evening when they would have been closed. We've got, it's great. We do that sort of thing there in Roachport. Here in Colorado on the it's close to the Crystal River Trail. We do a similar thing with the Redstone General Store. They do an amazing thing with some lunches and, deal with a lot of day travel, day traffic. We went to them and said, hey, we want to do breakfasts here, and, your food's off the charts. And, so we're bringing trips through 12 to 14 guests doing breakfast and leave $600, $700 behind at 7:30 in the morning when they were barely open before. So, some unique opportunities that we try to build out, intentionally.
Yeah, and I gotta vouch for the general store in Roachport, Missouri. It was awesome to have like a you know multi-course dinner there after a day on the trail. Just so everyone knows, Wilderness Voyagers has been the tour outfitter for the Trailblazer tour that happens annually for at least 10 plus years, I believe.
It's
Correct?
been a while, yes.
Yeah, I because I've been on staff for 8, so I know there was a few years before me. So have you gone on that trip before?
Yeah, I think the last one I was on was in Idaho, on the
Mm.
Trail of the Coeur d'Alene and the Hiawatha. So
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned like getting creative on how to lodge everyone and how to feed everyone. Can you talk a little bit about when you have those problems going to a town where there's just not a ton of things to well, one, things to places to stay or things to eat?
yeah, it can take us, growing up the business on the Great Allegheny Passage. We dealt with that initially there. There are a bunch of small towns, but being on the front end of that development, there still were not enough lodging opportunities for us, or, a traditional bed and breakfast with 2 or 3 rooms is just not, doesn't help us to operate. And so that's the first step when we're developing trips. And so there have been places like the Gap, the Erie Canal, Katy, where, we've gone into towns and, we're talking to folks and saying, well, you've got 4 rooms. We need 10 or 12. And so, I hope help get that conversation going in places. I mean, we're not going to take the credit for, 10 bed and breakfasts sprouting up, but the Erie Canal is one where we've more recently started running trips. We've been there about 6, 7 years. And as organized and as well known of a trail as that is, there's still a lack of lodging that you can bike into and out of.
Hmm.
And so, we go and talk to lodging folks and help push them along to find maybe some creative options to get us enough rooms, um, things like that. The meals that we create in places that there are not restaurants, but we know there's talent and there's food and hospitality. um, but then there are places we just can't make it work, so the Cowboy Trail is a great, we're watching the Cowboy Trail with great anticipation. We'd love to get out there and there's interest, but there's just nothing that really works. And there's not, yeah, there's a long ways to go there with infrastructure for people like us. But
Yeah, so you mentioned the Cowboy Trail. I've actually talked to Cassia, who you're married to, about doing the Cowboy Trail as a TBS tour, and we've had trouble with where's everyone going to stay? Where are we going to eat dinner? And I think that's a good example where it's like, well, I guess I'll ask you, what would you tell those people along the trail, um, what you need, what's essential?
um for us, it's really about the lodging, which is the bigger investment and the harder part. So we get that. Um, and that's where we've seen some really interesting things happen, along the Gap. Keep coming back to that, but it's so organized and mature as a product and as a destination that what started off as a small bed and breakfast, they bought the house next door, and then they bought the house next door, and they realized that to be consistent, to be able to welcome not just us, but as self-guided groups or self-organized groups, you just it to get it to become a really good, well-known destination, you need just more product and more support services. And folks are gonna bicycle travelers tend to be fairly intrepid. So, like the Trail Town program that exists, just helping folks go, hey, just have a stand somewhere with the tools available, or, a place to actually park bikes and not signs that say, don't put your bike here, things like that, the very basic things. So, as we're doing tour development, we have that conversation with business owners in those communities. So, it's fun to be out there in front of things, but it can also take a while to get to the point of having something that we can, share and promote.
Yeah, it's that hospitality, that kind of just little bit of effort goes a long way. I was thinking about one of the guides on the Missouri trip telling me that he ran out of water when he was doing that ride 10 years back, and he came across like somebody put out a cooler with like a mason jar that said, bottle of water, dollar,
Mhm,
and it's those little things that make you feel welcome on the trail. Um,
mhm,
and the Gap is a great example, and we keep coming back to it. But
mhm,
being in Ohiopyle, you really feel the community embrace
mhm.
the trail. Um, have you ever had situations where you wanted to do a tour and the community wasn't that into it?
Yeah, we have run into that in some places. It's been rare along trails, but there are other places in the country where we've operated some road trips and things where we've come into communities that, they just aren't interested. And so yeah, we've, you know, initially some reroutes, but there's a tour or two that we've put on the shelf because we're just like, this this region's not interested in bicycle touring and bicycle tourists. So
Hmm.
yeah, it is rare along trails. I think that by the time we start looking at trails that are more developed, longer distance, the towns have had enough of a buy-in. But we still Even along the Katy, which, has been around and welcoming travelers for a long time, we still run into some resistance. There are still people who will, you know, they may like the 2 miles of trail on their front yard, but they don't necessarily want us interlopers arriving with people from other places around the world. So, we've even recently run into that on the Katy. It's
Mhm.
quite, it's not the majority of folks by any stretch, but yeah.
Sure. And speaking of bicycle tourism, I was kind of interested. What would you tell somebody who was interested in doing a bike tour? What pieces of advice would you have for somebody who maybe thinks they can't ride 30 miles in a day or 50 miles in a day?
Um, wow, great question. I think uh, one, being a bicycle traveler, having an open mind about where you're headed and what you might see and what might you know, uh, Iowa and South Dakota come to mind. They're great destinations that we travel to. And often I get people like, Iowa, why are we going to go to Iowa? And you're like, oh, trust me, it's gonna be a different experience than, maybe going to a national park. But being on a bike, I think, everyone watching is a biker and an advocate. We know we're traveling at a different speed and a different level of intimacy. So there's that. And then I think, at the end of the day, if you've got all day to be traveling by bike, 20, 30 miles is pretty manageable. You might have to, put a little homework in and a little effort beforehand, but we get that a lot. People are like, oh, I never bike that much. Like, well, if you've got 6 hours to do it, this is what it breaks down to, and this is what it looks like. And, you're getting to stop and, take it in and then hop back on, and you'll forget about the last 2 miles. And, so I think, it's we love it. We think it's an amazing way to travel. And that's what we hear, the intimacy and the people they meet along the way. So it's not just, the landscape, it's the people.
Yeah, we mentioned that when we did the Ohio trip for the Trailblazer tour, I was a little hesitant, like, Yellow Springs to Cleveland. My father-in-law was from Cleveland, so my idea of Cleveland is like industrial. And that trip was amazing. Like
Hmm.
the scenery, it was beautiful. I loved it. I was pleasantly surprised. And I know that if Eric Oberg in the Yellow Springs office is listening, he's like, I told you so, I told you so. But yeah, that's a perfect example of when people are like, why would you go there? Um, and speaking of going there, I wanted to ask you because Cuba is a trip that you offer.
Yes, it
I'm
is.
just curious, how did that happen?
Uh, Great story. My wife and I were both very interested in Cuba going back, pre any sanctions being lifted. And so we traveled to Cuba in the early 2000s, just as a personal thing. We really wanted to go check it out. I had some friends that were Cuban, and they really had gotten us interested in it. So we initially traveled there via Canada, before we as Americans were really allowed to travel there. And so it was amazing. At the time, we were actually doing some looking around, trying to explore some whitewater on the island. And turns out that's not a good idea. But that's a whole nother story. But it led us to go, wow, we want to get back here and bike. Like this is amazing. And one, there's not a lot of vehicles. So, that just changes the whole, it's such a wild experience to be in Cuba. We ended up there in business wise. Another friend of mine who's an outfitter had gotten a license to run sea kayaking trips in Cuba. And then when he got his license, the Cuban government said, and you're running bike tours too. And he was like, wait a minute, I don't really know anything about bike tours. So he called me and he's like, hey, you want to run bike tours in Cuba? I'm like, you betcha. And so that's really how it came around. But, the first couple years were quite challenging to operate down there. The government was very involved. And, on one of our first trips, Our My wife ran the trips personally. She speaks Spanish and loves the place, and so pre-trip, she and guides were down, and the night before the trip, had a meeting with our Cuban handlers, and they're like, "Oh, well, here's your itinerary and route," and we're like, "What? This is our itinerary route?" They're like, "No, we're changing it," and we're like, that's tough to do on the fly here. Like we've never been there. So the challenges have gotten much less, but it's been got to think on your feet when you're doing business in Cuba.
Yeah, I would I would imagine so. But I mean, those are some of the challenges that come up with bike tours, like something like getting a flat tire and also, bad weather. Like it's the unexpected. And I think that kind of, at least for me personally, kind of comes into the adventure aspect of it that makes you remember the trip, remember where you were when your tent blew away, or
Right.
you know, or where you were when you had to walk with that flat tire waiting for the SAG vehicle.
Yeah,
Do
that's
you have any, I'm assuming you go on your own tours. Do you have any, worthwhile adventure stories you wanna share?
I mean, yeah, the unknown, the unplanned, that is such a piece of it. We operate throughout the West. We operate in Idaho and Washington and Colorado, and some of our biggest challenges or curveballs. We were riding into Glenwood Canyon a couple years ago as a fire started in the middle of the canyon. And so that was, quite a change of plan. Some of the groups behind at lunch, some of the groups in front actually literally biking into the beginning of a forest fire. Um, and that fire spread quickly and changed, I-70's closed and the next pass is closed. And, we spent 3 days kind of trying to make it up on the fly as places we were kind of intended to, that we were going, roads are being shut down and fires moving. So, that in recent years, I would say fires and heat have been our biggest challenges and curveballs and excitement. And yeah, as you're traveling as a bicycle traveler, having some flexibility and recognizing like we do not have control over these things at all. So
True.
yeah.
Well, I have time for about one more question, and it's I don't wanna say it's a heavy question, but I was just thinking what you were, we've been talking about. I feel like the tours I've done with Wilderness Voyagers over the years, all over the country, I feel like there's a very deliberate, attempt to interact with people on the ground and local business. Like, we're not going to, like, chain restaurants, we're going to mom and pop places, we're spending our money at mom and pop places, small businesses. And I know as you grew up in Ohiopyle, which is quintessential trail town, is that something that you think is you do deliberately, or do you think that people just naturally gravitate towards? Because I feel like when I do the tours, like I'll stop at local bike shops and buy a t-shirt or
Mhm.
just something to spend money because I feel like I'm giving back.
It's quite deliberate. I mean, curate is a word that's probably overused at this point in time, but that's how we approach it. I did grow up in a town where, you know, I think I've been definitely shaped by those interactions with people that are arriving in town, and learning about who they are and where they've come from, and what made Ohiopyle, this small Appalachian town, so interesting, and wanting to share it with those that visit. So I think that's probably our common thread as we're building trips and how we build trips. If Kasi and I are out in the world working on a new tour, that is our tendency to, slide into that bike shop, and, we're a similar person as that person, and we're talking to them, and I think we just gravitate towards those kind of places. And, we're family business that have grown, and but I really appreciate what's allowed us to grow. And when we can help a small town, a small business, make their next step, I think we that's a lot of gratification on the backside of what we do. The gratification of running great trips and getting people to new cool places and, giving them memories that, are on their Christmas cards. That's half of it. The other half is, what we get out of, working with, the two general stores we've mentioned have been really fun situations, to help them grow their business, give them, hopefully the tipping point to make it way more sustainable than it was before. So, you know,
Yeah, I will say Rocheport, Missouri, I was there doing the Katy and the Rock Islands 6 years ago. And then when we were there earlier this month, I noticed new businesses, new construction, new housing,
Mhm.
um, you know, just some growth. And it was really cool to see that and to see the trailside businesses that had just started when I was there 6 years ago expanding and other businesses kind of modeling themselves to cater to the trail. And I really feel like that's kind of essential to trail towns or towns that want to
Mhm.
cater to the trail. You really got to just kind of uh, be creative and think of new ways. Like you mentioned, simple things like providing ice cream and drinks, like that works. Is there anything else that you would suggest to those communities on the trail to do?
Um, I think the nuts and bolts, I think, are pretty straightforward things. We talked about tools and bike racks and things like that. Um, I think they need to recognize that it can be a lot more than just the dollars from an ice cream cone. One of the things that we see out of our guests is folks who are like, wow, this town's amazing. I'm going to come back and look at moving here. That's happened organically time and time again on trips. And, then we've got guests who travel with us intentionally, like, hey, I was thinking about moving to Missouri. So what better way than to bike through 200 miles of it? So I think that the towns being really expansive in their thinking about how they're presenting themselves to the world, to the visitors. So that hospitality piece is a little, deeper than just, oh, a great meal and an ice cream cone, but you're really putting your town on the map and exposing it to people from all over the world. And I think that um, sometimes, or we've heard it, that, you know, you're sitting talking to someone in that small town in Missouri or Idaho or wherever, and, we're giving them some validation of, hey, your little town is meaningful and important and very interesting to folks. And so that can open their eyes and change, the way they approach the world as a town and as individuals. So, yeah, I think it can be a lot bigger than just the dollars of an ice cream cone, and that's little more ethereal and hard to communicate to a town, but I think it's a big part of it.
Hmm. Well, I'm looking at time. I just wanted to ask you, do you have any parting words for some of the trail advocates that support rail trails, support trail networks across the country?
Uh, I mean, the work they're doing, the financial resources, they make a big difference. And as you said, like Cleveland, the trail up to Cleveland, that corridor has seen improvements of, people taking care of their properties and, you know, household incomes and things like that. So it is a big deal, the development that we're doing around the country with these trails. So yeah, keep up the good work. Yeah, be open to some some un I don't know. I think there's some opportunity out there to help get some infrastructure going that will really jump jumpstart some economic development, and it can look very different than standard economic development. So helping that small bed and breakfast add rooms and, things that banks and other economic development entities don't do. I think so. Yeah, stay flexible and be creative.
Spoken like a true small business entrepreneur. Thank you so much. And I wanted to say,
Yeah.
as somebody who grew up in a family business, I really admire what your family's done, what you're doing, and the effect you're having on your community. It's really cool to see.
Well, thank you. We're gonna keep doing it. It's better than working for a living. So
Spoken like a rafter. Thanks. Have a good enjoy your off-season break.
Will do.
All
Thanks. Have
right.
a great fall, everyone.